first time I saw a hippie, I was up to nearly my waist in water, standing opposite on one of the many crossings on Main Arm when a car pulled in on the concrete and said, and a voice yelled out, "Have you got any land for sale?"
I think the strangest thing to me was the fact they used to run around with no clothes on. They'd go to the swimming pools and
I can remember picking up a hitchhiker somewhere on the highway in those days, and I said, "Where are you going?" And he said, "I'm going into Mullumbimby. I want some Mullumbimby madness." So in one sense it was marijuana, but in another sense it was a bit of the feeling of the day.
1976, and I'd been on a daily current affairs program called This Day Tonight when the Aquarius Festival happened. I didn't get down here, but we as a program covered it, and that made quite an impact in the country. I mean, there were various festivals starting to happen, and the kind of hippie movement had started to make its impression in Australia well and truly, and so I was curious to go back there several years later, and you could argue whether I maybe should have left it another few years to actually begin to see some kind of trend. But you could see that even in, I think it was the 3 years, maybe 4, that the people who had come for the festival and stayed, or come to the festival, gone away and come back, that you get a sense of a pattern of life that had already started to develop. So really, we were trying to get a sense of what they were about.
1970 was the height of the anti-Vietnam protests. A lot of things like that were going on in the world. There was 1969, actually, when I'd been in Vietnam, was the moon landing and Woodstock. And after the experience of sort of virtually being institutionalised for most of my life with boarding school, university, the army, I felt like it was my time. I think the first people who discovered, so to speak, Mullumbimby were the two McElraith brothers, Chris and David, and they said, "Hey, Mullumbimby, that's terrific." So we went down there and looked at land there, and Mullumbimby was amazing, really, in that a lot of different people from a lot of different places all turned up there at the same time, and bought in the same valleys and next door valleys, and it was very interesting, and so it just rolled on.
Rusty. Right, tried. You won't come round the bloody tree and you won't get past till you do.
My wife had died a few years earlier and I was living on my own with my family. And I said, yes. And he said, how much do you want for it? I said, it took him about this much longer, another minute. I said, $4,000 per 100 acres to Colin Scattergood, who was the curly-haired man sitting in the car with Jack Donahue, the real estate agent. Oh, well, he said, and he was looking around and came back to check, but he told me at that time, oh, I'll take 200. And then a fortnight later, he arrived back saying, I'll take another 200. And that was how, there was no discussion, much went into it at all.
We'd been surfing through the 60s up here, and so we knew about Mullumbimby. So in 1971, I came up here and I was looking for communal life, a communal lifestyle. Very into the communist philosophy and young and naive. And met Nancy in Maynarm, and she said, my husband Colin's in Sydney. When you go back to Sydney, go and introduce yourself. And Colin met me there at Lurline Bay, and he said, you're most welcome to come and share in the commune.
Well, the land was very cheap. People were more or less walking out because there was just nothing to employ them there. And the school closed too, and the sawmill closed, and it employed a lot of people. All those hills were bananas right round, but the bad cyclones and that wiped a lot of those out, and they just got so disheartened they left. They said, we've had enough of that. And
more than enough.
And the dairy farms, they closed down because we used to send cream, and then the factories wouldn't take cream anymore. They took bulk milk, and to put your property over into that was going to be very costly, so that's when we went out of dairying too.
Going back to 1969, I was in India with my girlfriend, and we'd been there for about a year and a half. She was 7 months pregnant. We had nowhere to go to have the baby, so we threw the I Ching, and the I Ching said that it would be advantageous to cross the Great Waters. So we took that as meaning it was time to go back to Australia. And I had visions of going back and starting a commune somewhere in Cairns or joining a commune. We really wanted to be part of a community. And so we came back to Australia, spent some time in Melbourne, made some money, bought a van and headed north. And as we were heading north, we kept hearing about this place called Mullumbimby and this guy called Colin Scattergood, and that everybody we spoke to said, oh, you must go and see this guy Colin Scattergood in Mullumbimby. As we were driving up the valley, it was late afternoon, evening, sun was setting, and we were just stunned. And we drove up in silence, and I think that we both knew at that time that we'd come home.
Anyway, a different era, isn't it? A different era. Well, we first came down here because my partner used to smoke and he used to score down here. I think I was naked 90% of the time. And then he left me and moved down here while I was doing my dip ed. And I managed to finish that with 2 small children. And then I came down to see if he, to see him, and I sort of moved into his caravan while he moved out of the caravan at Middle Pocket. And then I started looking for a piece of land, and I found it up in Huonbrook from old Malcolm, who used to stand on the road and stop every passing car to say hello to them and offer them a cup of tea and biscuits. And he told me that old Blanche was selling a block of land, and she hadn't even looked at it yet, but she was thinking of doing it. And I went up there and I fell in love with it.
Picture an old farm, cut it up into 10 different blocks, and they can live and enjoy the lifestyle which we had to farm. They'd only have to look after around their home. I'd have to look after 400. In fact, I was looking after 600 acres of the land. And how different they can sit back and enjoy it, go out to work or do cottage industries, crafts and things, which is a rather pleasant way to live, I should think, without worrying about a couple of hundred head of different stock or digging and working and humping bananas.
This was the property we had there, all that one, the clean old property that one was. The property at Huonbrook, it was selected by Cole's grandfather, many years back, wasn't it?
Oh.
And that went down through the age, and Cole was the grandson, and he was the one that cut that property up.
Dairy farming on it with cattle and that, bananas and pigs. That's about the income, I think. Yeah, pretty rough country to keep tidy. I thought when we sailed out up to Huonbrook, I thought that was the best day of my life. I said, I've had a fair share of it up here, and I think I was coming up around the 50s, I said, when we got out of that. And I always said, well, out to the, I can't think of their names now, the fellows that moved up there.
The alternate people, we call
the
them.
alternate people. I said, well, we owe it to them for our be able to move, and which they moved in. And when I got on the old tractor, I drove it down here, and I said, this is great. Heading down into the flat country.
This way. Come around this way. Yeah, sit. Now come here, back in here. That's it. Good girl. You can get your photo taken.
We put a sign at the gate, and they were all sold from the gate. There was agents were only involved in one area, one.
We sold about three blocks off the gate, didn't we?
That's right.
Only one fella said, he said, I can't understand you, folk here. He said, giving this beautiful country up. Beautiful, I was saying.
Well, actually beautiful water right through the mountains there. They're all spring fed to beautiful water.
Was good water.
The house on the distance, God, John, that's from the orchard. Unbelievable, isn't it?
That's the other side of the valley you can't see through at all. I was 27 when we saw the property for the first time, and at that stage, early on in the piece, I was a trained special teacher, but I'd left teaching and I was travelling fairly extensively in Asia. We had a friend who had a house which was in an abandoned village close to Brunswick Heads on the other side of the river. The weather was like this, so were beautiful days, day after day after day, and quite cold nights, which is very much Northern Rivers winters. And we loved it, and after a few weeks I said to my brother, I really like it here, let's have a look around for some land. And this was the only property that we looked at. And we picked it up for, at the time, $40,000, which was very extraordinary. It was 180 acres with a nice big house, excellent water, and it was just a beautiful block of land, and we fell in love with it.
And then we shared it afterwards.
And then we shared it, because it was such a big piece of land that it seemed ridiculous to, that you could have cows on it, but that you couldn't have people on it. So we shared it, which was very much against all of the New South Wales government constraints at that time, and slowly they adopted the idea that rural properties could be shared, and they've run through this process of continually making that more and more expensive ever since.
Well, I was living in Europe. I was born in Holland, then I moved to Belgium, Antwerp, then to France, where I lived for 3 years and worked in the theatre. And then we felt that Europe was too full of people, so we moved to Australia, where we knew Hiska and Vincent. And when we arrived in Sydney, we were going to work in Sydney, looking for work in the theatre. But Vincent was there to pick us up, and he drove us to Upper Maynarm. When we got to Maynarm, we stopped at Kohinoor, where there was a creek, and there was a whole bunch of people swimming naked in the creek, and they said, "Welcome home." That's the rule. Oh goodness, no. Well, we were told that when in Rome, you do as the Romans do, so we took our gear off, and then they all said, "Oh, you're the whitest thing we've ever seen." It was completely alien. The ladies were walking around in nightgowns and gumboots, and I was there with high heels and mini skirts. So it was completely alien. But, my life is... how you call it? I'm a bit of a drifter. I just go with the flow. So I made the most of it.
We had both been travelling for 3 years, and we met in Bali and then came back to Sydney. And
it was 69,
70.
Yeah. We went also to Europe, and we visited some friends in Switzerland, and they were renovating the old farmhouse, which was perhaps 400 years old. And in that farmhouse, they had to build a fallout shelter. Every farmhouse, every new building had to have a fallout shelter where they had to put blankets, they had guns in there, they had tin food, because there was an atomic war going to happen and between Russia and America, and it wouldn't happen over America or Russia, it would happen over Europe. So when we came here to Australia, we always looked at these magazines about Earth's Garden and so on. We said we have to go away from the city.
And be self-sufficient on the land.
Yeah.
So we came up in an old combi and broke down at Bangalore. and
we had to hurry back to the Pink Floyd concert in
yes.
Sydney.
And the boat that was taking us to India. So it was just this little gap before we were going to India. So we broke down in Bangalore, and we had some friends who had a macrobiotic restaurant in Bangalore, twins. So we stayed there, and they said, we have a friend who's bought some land. And so we drove up Maynarm up to Agati, and we couldn't believe it because we'd never been off the highway before. And we came through Maynarm Valley, and it was so beautiful with Mount Warning and Chincogan, and ended up on this piece of land that was stunning, looked down towards the ocean and to Mount Warning.
It's a whole range.
The whole range, and he wasn't there. And later we met him, and he said, "Oh no, that's not my land, that's for sale." And so we said, "Oh, let's buy that piece of land." We went into town, and it was $500 for 22 acres. We went, "Oh, right, okay."
Cleared.
We're on our way to India. We'll buy it, and we'll go to India. And when we come back, we'll do the self-sufficiency trip there.
The choices were to come north or to go south. Going south had a few things going for it in that we used to go down there surfing all the time, so it was quite familiar. But it was also very cold, and They were starting the wood chips down there at that time, and it was getting quite redneck and quite, they were very anti anything alternate. And the friends that I knew that had come up here, they'd sort of embraced the whole, you know, space. Everyone was willing to take them in here because the community was dying, really. And when we first came to Mullumbimby, it was like everyone had their pet hippie in the shops. You'd go to the shop and some shopkeeper would adopt you.
And then we found a little house that was completely fallen apart. And in the floods we couldn't go anywhere. It was a real freak out because when I arrived there I said, "Where's the telephone?" "No telephone." "Where's the jobs?" "No jobs." "Where's the bus?" "No bus." "No nothing. It was really discombobulating, but we got used to it.
We were really like refugees from the city and had the attitude that we'd escaped to the bush. We were hermiting, we were escapees from the city, and most of us came from Sydney or Melbourne, and that we were trying to get away from authoritarian kind of direction, and therefore council parameters of building codes, etc. were definitely not on our first things to do list.
No regulations whatsoever.
What? You need a permit to build?
Never knew about it, never heard of it.
We were just totally oblivious to that.
Yeah. Everybody just built whatever they felt like. It was very exciting. They could build anything, yeah.
Well, one of the councillors of Byron Shire took exception to this article in the paper when Cole Scattergood addressed the Rotary Club of Mullumbimby and wanted to know what's going on in the western part of the Shire.
Follow me.
I think there's 3 of the stumps are still left from the dome, and you can see my present rammed earth house in the background. And here was my separate kitchen. I had a separate kitchen here, beautiful shingled roof, wood stove. Mate and I came up after we'd got the land to lease in 1972. I went back to Sydney and worked a little bit, saved up some money, and then we came back early. I think it must have been March 73. And we drove up in a combi and we had the joists. Here's some of the joists. We had joists off an old wharf in Glebe. Looks like the white ants are into them a bit now. And they're all off an old wharf in Glebe. And we'd had all the struts cut for the dome, which is made up of single pieces of wood about 1 metre long, and they all fit together in a triangle. And we had them all in the combi, and we came up with a combi. And I had an old crosscut saw. I found an old crosscut saw in the bush. I still have that in the workshop, and sharpened it all up. And we cut some grey gums down with an axe. It looked so beautiful in the forest. It was just still virtually bush with this crystal. Had this crystal shape.
This is the living shelter. Right, living shelter, yes. This is all different houses around the area and in Australia. This is my dome. This is the hub that you just photographed. It's the cooking stove, the old Crown cooker. These are the shakes that went on the outside, the hardwood shakes. They come out of Mullumbimby State Forest. There's an overview. It wasn't quite finished then. There was a glass pergola went on top.
When we began building the house, we were driving around the back streets of Brunswick Heads, and there was a huge pile of timber, which turned out to be a whole house that that a very nice old Italian gentleman had pulled down, and he'd realised that he wasn't going to use it. So when I asked him, I wasn't the first to ask him, but when I asked him if it was for sale, it was. And I think we paid $500 for the whole house, which included the tin and like the teak floors and like lots of like really good stuff. And I, without any skills at all, sort of brought 13 combi loads of like massive combi loads of. It was a split windscreen ute, so it was capable of carrying a mozza of stuff, and I just kept throwing these big piles of sort of naily timber on the ground, and from there we put 8 lampposts in the ground and started building up from there, and funnily enough finished up with a very good result.
The other thing was just like rolling hills and incredibly, beautiful view. We were like sitting on a knob, 360 degrees, whether now it's completely, the trees have grown right around. It used to be you could see Wanganui over there, Wanganui Gorge is over there, and you could see it so clearly, but now things have changed, so...
Alan and me and the 2 kids. We'd just probably built that house 3 months after we arrived, and we were living in it. Well, it's all stone underneath with the wooden on top. Everything was recycled. This was the bath of the kids. We had a rock bath that the kids used to be in. I had that looking beautiful. Look, we scored all these tiles. That's where our floor was. We scored all these tiles. I went up to Brisbane and went to an old tiling shop and dragged them all out of the rubbish bin. That was our lounge room. Look at that. That was the dunny. Now, it was just a pit dunny, a bucket dunny, that one was. And there used to be a piece of tin just out of sight of the photo. And underneath that piece of tin used to live a red-bellied black snake. That all the kids used to know that the red-bellied black snake was there. And he was just part of the family as well. He knew we were there and he didn't get in our way. And we knew he was there and didn't get in his way. I lived in a caravan for 3 months with my kids, while my partner then, a new partner, started building a stone house. It took us 3 months to build that stone house, and we moved in and lived beside a creek under the palm trees, and we worked very hard on the land. We landscaped it and dug dams and planted trees and had kids. Now, you've got to understand, my house was completely open. To cook in my kitchen, if it was really raining, I sometimes had to put a raincoat on. It was that open. The bats, the little tiny bats, would come in and roost at night, and because they loved the heat of your bed, they would go and roost right above your bed, which was just delightful. And the birds would come in and they'd sit on the beams and they'd wake you up in the morning. And I had so many carpet snakes live in the house. At one stage there would have been 10 carpet snakes living in the house, and it was mating season. And so when they mate, they all twirl up and they would be hanging from the rafters and falling on my stove and falling on the bed. And then you never knew whether they were fighting or mating, because it's very similar. And you knew they were fighting when one turned around and bit the other one, and then you knew they were fighting. And there were two males.
Coming from the city and being a city kid, I knew nothing about, orientation and, water, access, north facing, all those things that are so important. And then, so really, I just landed in paradise. Just got so lucky. When we originally came here, Peter and I, and we came with another guy called Ted, we bought this land from Tom Mott and his brother. I just turned 20. We bought 111 acres, and when we came here there was an old fibro house over the hill from where I am now, and Peter, Ted and I moved into that. Basically it was a white ant riddled wooden frame with fibro walls, and had been getting used as a fertiliser shed, so it had an absolutely ghastly smell and probably very highly toxic, but we didn't know. This spot where we are now had Lance Mott's bananas on it, and when we bought the land he was removing them, so this ended up a clear area, and Peter and I decided that this was where, one look at that view and you just go, yeah, we're here, this is it. It was windy here last night, so there's leaves everywhere. That's why I stay. Yeah, I never get sick of looking at that view, ever. And really, here we are in 2015, and at night I think I can see 3 lights down that valley. And we built the $10 shed. And that was our first foray into building. We'd never put a hammer and nail together before. So Ted's dad worked at Lysart's in Wollongong, and him and my dad kept loading up trailers and coming up on, for fortnight holidays or something with every bit of unimaginable junk. I've always been really interested in architecture, and that was basically what I would have really liked to have studied, but my parents couldn't afford to keep me at school that long, because at that point architecture was the longest university course of 8 years. And I remember when I very first came here, the Narada crew had this book called Shelter. It was a really big book that I think had been created in America. America being not that far ahead of us, but probably 5 or 6 years doing alternate things before it really started happening here. So I used to avidly study it every night, right, we can make a turbo electric water wheelie, whatever. And anyway, so the concept of, I did not want to live in a straight house. I didn't want to live in 4 walls. So then, okay. So I started drawing this. So this is my first attempt at architecture, and so far it's my last, although I'd really like to do it again and improve upon it, but whether it happens, I don't know.
We met an Indonesian young man called Rio in Bali, and lived with him in India, and he lived in a cave, we lived in a little house, he was like a sadhu. And so he came with his girlfriend and moved up to the land too, and so also then made clothes and made enough money to build a house. And then we started to build a house. Then our friend Werner got together with Tara, and they built a house there. And then our other friend we met in Penang, Radha, Christina, who was at the ashram with you, wasn't she? She also built a house there. So we had like 4 houses.
But at first we thought we were going to have one house for all of us. And then after living in the little hut in the shop in town, we realised we have to have our own space.
Yeah. And that was in 74. And in 74 was when Lismore flooded, was a huge cyclone, one after the other. And we went to the little hut and the wind blew in, but we were sort of sheltered. But there was on the side was a wind roaring, between the trees. And on both sides, and we were just sort of huddled there. But we were all right. We had the fire conditioners going, and we're quite happy. And so that was our initiation. We didn't get out of gumboots just about for a year.
But anyway, that's the house that, how does that come up? We came back from India, not a penny to our name. He had a job the next day. We were back in the markets the next week, and we made enough money to build our first house on Agati. But it was a struggle, and because we didn't know a thing. We're totally city kids with no knowledge of any of that sort of anything practical. Gerhard had never held more than a paintbrush in his hand.
I was drilling away and hammering away, and
These are the Bibles. This is an interesting book. This is Living on the Earth. This is a very 70s book. Peace. Lots of wholemeal stuff. And this is the last Whole Earth catalogue. And it's got every sort of living on the earth contraption and device and technique you could possibly imagine.
And we tried to get on with setting ourselves up here and opening the land and getting some water happening, and it was very basic to begin with. It was bucket baths, and it was really pioneer living. We felt like we were doing what the original settlers had been doing back in the early 1800s.
This councillor from Byron Bay challenged me about these people coming to live in the area. When he arrived, he came in and told me we'll have to inspect all these homes, what these people are doing and everything. I said, I'll go along with you, but you'll start at Byron Bay, because I knew at Byron Bay at that time you could walk to the corner of one of the main streets and see the sky up through the old rusted iron on the roofs and the things there. And I said, if you do that, I'll vote and go along with you. No more was ever heard of a council inspection of the area.
There were about 30 of us at the time. None of us had any money, except for the McElwraiths, who had their father's money, and Colin Scattergood, who came up from Sydney. He had his incense and oils business, but yeah, most of us had no money. And trying to keep our cars running and going to town minimally to save petrol, and yes, it was very hard to get work here. I went to the CES in Mullumbimby, and of course I received a letter in the post saying, look, there was no work and there was no possibility of getting the dole, so here we were, stranded. And I do have to admit at times to I had been really living stressed and hungry, and having caught bush turkey, boiling bush turkey, and at one stage I remember, in another stage of desperation, I remember seeing the farmer had bread deliveries to his local box and actually having thieved his bread.
But it was a struggle in that there was we didn't get the dole. And we had a small shop in Mullumbimby. It was $5 a week. And it was wet season, so 7 of us lived in the back of the shop. The front, we had all this hippie stuff, and there was no customers.
Oh, well, it was okay. It
was a little bit.
And that involved us making clothing of velvet in those days, a cotton velvet that you could dye, and we'd go to the beach and dye these clothes and put them into our shop, and people would come in and they'd go, oh, gorgeous stuff, I actually like what you're wearing. So you'd go strip it off and here you go, and find something else in the rack, and this would continue often, and also we had lots of input of artists in the area, potters and jewellers and things, and they all put their things in the shop too. The sunflowers next door were open to each other, and that created a whole little atmosphere. And Gerhard was a very good artist, and he painted the outside of the shop, and it had these goddesses and things all over it, and no one had done that in Mullumbimby before. They started doing it in Nimbin, but not so gorgeous. He had a style, and it was really beautiful.
But it was good because it had electricity, it had a laundry out the back, so we could cook there and live there and survive the wet.
Often we end up sleeping in the shop because we couldn't even get home to Maynarm, and we only had one car between all the four of us, thinking we'd be really economical. And then I actually bought a motorbike because I thought, well, I like to get out when I want.
So we used to go back twice a year to Melbourne to sell flowers. It was a seasonal thing. We sold flowers at the universities, and we started in, I think it was about February, March when the unis opened, and we would sell flowers until Mother's Day, I think it was. And then after that it started getting too cold and not enough flowers around, so we'd go back north. And then we'd come back for the daffodils in the spring. There's sort of a tradition in the East of giving hospitality to travellers. So I'd always lived without money until we started selling flowers, and making money was a new experience for me.
We were just excited by the fact that we didn't have to have a job, that we could just live outside the system, and that it was healthy, and it was it was just outside the system, and that was really exciting. And the fact that we could build our own houses and grow our own food. And so we decided to go to Sydney and work, because we knew we could work in Sydney, make clothes and sell them. And so 4 of us jumped in the car and went down there. And while we were there, our house burnt down. The one that we just finished building, the one that we'd been building for 3 years, where Gerhard had spent 3 months cutting shingles. After the fire, everybody got a bit freaked out, I think, and the other couple who were there, Werner and Tara, decided to move closer down to the school and to other people.
And I can remember when Peter and I split up, I tried to get the single parents pension, and basically they would come and sniff your sheets. You know, they were so adamant that we were sex maniacs and, you know, loose women, and we were obviously, you know, selling it on the streets or something, and completely undeserving of any sort of government handout. So no, it was pretty tough, really, the first quite a few years.
We had a little barter market where people you'd go down with a bucket full of capsicums, and you'd come home with 2 bananas, 3 oranges, a mandarin, and a cabbage. And whenever it was flooding in Finn Village, and nobody could get to town, Tommy Mott would drop off crates of bananas on everybody's doorstep, which was wonderful. And so it was basically a hand-to-mouth kind of existence.
I was a bit of a hypocrite in a way, in that I was running away from the consumerism, but on the other hand I was doing a bit of freelance writing for advertising, turning people into consumers, so that was a bit odd, but I was only doing very little, as much as I had to. Michael and Gary were already making mushroom candles, so they were making 3 or 4 different types of mushroom candles, which we used to sell up and down the coast as far as Melbourne. There weren't very many health food or hippie shops then, so it was pretty tough. There was no dole, and Michael and I were also making soybean coffee. We'd buy soybeans and roast them and grind them and package them and sell them to the health food shops. Everyone around was doing something reasonably creative. I mean, Tony and Bronnie were making banana chips and doing things like that. I think Rule was already into his electronics, making odd things like the alpha machine and for measuring alpha waves, that sort of thing. People were crocheting. It was very creative.
You can do anything that you really want to do, if you just want to do it. Say, if there's something you've never done before, like sawing wood, and you've just learned how to do it, you might lose a little bit of confidence, like perhaps there's a guy there and he can do it in 10 minutes, saw up this piece of wood, and it's taking you 15 or 20 minutes. It doesn't matter, like you don't have to get uptight or feel it, oh, I can't do that kind of thing, just because you're a little bit slower. As long as you can do it and do it well, that's the most important thing.
I thought it was a very nice, interesting, funny little place because it was obviously a collapsing dairy town, and there were lots of empty shop fronts in the street. And I thought, I might start a practice here, because in those days you could just start a practice as a doctor. It's not so easy now to do that.
Well, it was very quiet.
It was empty. There was three cars and a horse.
A horse. On Saturday, everything was just about shut, except maybe the butcher and the baker. And a horse cart was going around sweeping. And it was really a quiet
And we got
town.
this empty shop there for $5 a week. It was fantastic.
After we'd been there for a year, I decided to kind of get together with a few friends and start a spring festival.
So that was a Mullumbimby Spring Festival, 5th and 6th of September in the Civic Hall. I forgot which years it was.
I put posters up all over the place, and I drove around for a couple of months finding people to bring their things. So people brought art and pottery and paintings and produce and things we made ourselves. And we hired the Civic Hall in Mullumbimby for 3 days. And that was a great success. It was a funny thing, though, again, because this was 1973. So I went to every shop and I found that half the shopkeepers in Mullumbimby loved us, the other half hated us. Mangelson's had a shop. He said the hippies were the best thing that ever happened to him because he sold a stereo system to a guy with big holes in his jeans who looked like he'd been sleeping outside, and none of the locals spent money on that kind of stuff.
All these people, they started to come in now. In the early days, a lot of our sales was all tick, most of it, maybe 70-80%. Was put on the books. Now, as the people started to come in the 70s, we found we've been involved with better stores, we had a better buying power, we had a better selection of goods, especially electrical stuff and that sort of bizarre. We had that opportunity to really expand, and it was then that we found that a lot of the people that were living up the arm and in their own little hideaways, whatever you like to call them, they didn't need to book up things. They had cash, and we weren't used to that.
This area of New South Wales, at that stage, had just suffered a long drought in the late 60s, and Britain had joined the common market and the dairy industry had collapsed here. And so there was a net population loss over those 4 or 5 years up till 1970. And so, like Nimbin, for example, was virtually empty. It was a dead town. And there were lots of vacant shops in all the little towns, Bangalore, Mullumbimby, everywhere. And so they saw it as a sort of a rejuvenation.
So I think the hippie movement actually sort of opened up the area and brought a few extra dollars, and particularly when people started farming, we'll call it.
After they were there a while, we knew why they were coming up into there. Well, a different means of making a quid.
Their land.
You know what I mean? You don't. No, they'd be puffing that stuff they shouldn't have been puffing. Just between you and me. Marijuana. They used to grow it. Then they'd go and sell it.
I love photos. I love it that my photos have become historical documents. So Joe Smith, who lived down the hill from us, where we stayed when we first arrived, he was a strawberry farmer from New Zealand and a hard worker. And I remember him looking around one day and saying, "You know, I reckon you could grow marijuana here." And I was very doubtful, but he put some seeds in, and that was the beginning of Mullen Madness.
This man, a young sailor from Africa, arrived with a big bag of Durban poison in his trunk, and I'm sure there would have been dope in other places, but this is what I know. And the year after, of course, once that was smoked, the seeds were used to start growing crops.
The dope almost sort of grew wild, really. You just had to throw a roach over the balcony, and next thing you knew there'd be some plants that come up. But you had to hide them, or you'd get busted. So people started growing dope, first to smoke, and then everybody needed income, so they started selling it. People came up from Melbourne and Sydney to buy it because it was such good dope.
And there was a few people, there wasn't a lot of people actually growing it at that time. There was a few people growing a sizable crop, and that changed everything. Because money came in the valley. So people could afford to buy a car, people could afford to build a house that was not just held together by twigs and elastic bands.
In the beginning, people were basically growing it in their backyards, the lantana was thick here, and you only had to clear a triangle in the lantana. It was surrounded by a wall of lantana, and hey presto, the lantana makes good soil as well, so, you'd have a few plants. I mean, we weren't growing acreages. We might have had, an area of the size of a large house with, 20, 25, 30 plants.
We never ever got involved in their background as far as the way they made their money. We weren't interested. We treat people as they are, irrespective of what they get up to. If they go overboard, well, okay, that's a different matter.
They're only growing small quantities too.
Oh, yeah, more or less, mainly well, as far as we knew, they just to smoke themselves, but goes from that to whatever, I suppose.
Because one of the young ones said to me one day, "Look, if ever any gets grown on your property, well, don't you be upset, we'll take the blame for it, not you." So, and we never ever had, you never saw any growing on our property at all, no.
I gave them the message there when they first came.
That's right.
That we didn't go along with growing that stuff. If you're growing here, you shouldn't be. if you get caught, don't say that we're mixed up in it. And, no. We don't sell it just to have a bit to puff yourself. No.
We ended up being involved in the first helicopter raid here, where the helicopters came and were looking for marijuana close by to people's buildings. It was actually a very nasty, threatening kind of scenario when the helicopter did come. It was coming very low over people's places. We heard that the helicopter pilot was actually an ex-Vietnam veteran. The downforce of the blades was so strong that a lot of the trees, the young trees that we were growing, and a lot of the regrowth that was beginning after the banana farms had starting to be regenerated, that was all snapping off trees and blowing down the branches. And at that stage, the police didn't have much of a PR sphere. They were treating us as the terrorists in the hills, so to speak. They were looking for the Viet Cong in the hills, and we were the hill tribes.
I know a couple of instances where the sergeant of the police station pulled somebody up and said, the drug squad's coming through tomorrow with the helicopters. And because he knew that the alternate people weren't getting into fights on Saturday night, they weren't the one causing trouble for him. They weren't doing robberies and break-and-enters, and maybe their cars were a bit on the old side. But were basically law-abiding people, except for the marijuana issue.
And I know other businesses in town. They didn't want the cops hammering the hippies, because that's their business was picking up town. It was see the hidden cash that was coming in. We had a better cash flow. We were starting to get smiles on the bank managers' faces, and so things started to look pretty good.
The Surfies were there 10 years before the hippies. They loved Byron Bay, and I was a councillor at Byron Bay. It didn't include Mullumbimby municipality at that time, so Mullumbimby municipality was left as a little island on its own, surrounded by Byron Shire.
Mullumbimby was a National Party town. Byron Bay was a Labor Party town, and because Byron Bay had the butter factory, the piggery, the meat works, all those sorts of things. So it was, a Labor Party town, whereas Mullumbimby was a National Party town, old farmers and things like that. And so they'd never agreed with Byron Bay, and so Mullumbimby had its own water supply, it had its own little electricity plant, and it had a history of being different. And with the Seventh-day Adventists, the Finns, the Italians, there's quite a lot of Italians around the place, banana farmers, they're making grappa and things like that. So it had a history of welcoming people.
I think we thought of ourselves as all one mob because we were different. We knew we were different. We were different from the townspeople. We saw ourselves as country in a way that the locals didn't see themselves as country. We were very much hayseeds, and we were interested in arts and crafts and environmental issues. We thought we knew a lot more than they did. But yeah, we were young and we were into sex and drugs and rock and roll, I guess. So that made us all one mob.
We did a lot of what we used to call smorgasbording God, which was sort of dipping into various religions and looking at them all and taking a bit out of this and a bit out of that, which was always interesting. And I think we thought actually, which was rather foolish but very idyllic, that we could change the world.
And we were ushering in, we were the children of the new age. you know, the new way was the way of marijuana and LSD, and expanded consciousness.
We were sort of challenging the whole borderlines of normal society, I guess. And you could get away with it here.
Whilst we were building our houses up in Agadi and sort of had this, community sort of establishing itself, there were a lot of communities in the area establishing itself at the same time. Here in the valley, as you said, over at Ewenbrook, we knew some people who were doing it there. There were MOs. Then in the Shannon, Kyogle area, so it was like we felt very connected, and it wasn't, just us. It was all just happening like that, like a movement.
There are a lot of things in the community that in Upper Main Arm and also Ewenbrook and Wilson's Creek and so on that brought everybody together. It was the adversity.
And people really hung together very well. During the floods, we pooled our food, made sure that everyone had enough to eat. It was really nice way to live.
It was wonderful. I remember Finn Village like in the early 70s, like if it was Christmas or there was a party, you didn't have to do anything. You take some food, you take a bottle of champagne, you just start walking down the creek and you'd bump into a party. And everybody else would do that. They would bring some food, something to drink, they'd sit down with the children, and it was great.
We bought a truck for the property, a shared truck, and we all shared this truck. And so we had old car seats in the back of it, and so we'd all jump in the truck, and 6 or 8 people in the back. You wouldn't never get away with it now. And we'd drive off to the moon dances or the markets, so there was quite a lot of doing things together. Colin Scattergood bought the old church from the Anglican church, I think it was, from Main Arm Village. And we all went down there and helped jack it up and get the low loader underneath and then drive it up Main Arm and then lift it off the truck. And so that Kohinoor Hall was a great focal point for community interaction.
In Cooper's Lane there were lots of hippies, hippies with kind of Buddhist leanings and kind of hippie dress, that kind of thing, which I wasn't really. But Cooper's Lane was that part of Main Arm where the poor went, really. It was where the single mums lived and where the, young families, and all of the sheds in Cooper's Lane were occupied by people who didn't own them. And at that time, nobody paid rent. They were all free. And how you got a shed in Cooper's Lane was basically you inherited it from whoever had been living in it and was moving out and would say, would you like our shed? I could tell you typically, because we lived out of the town, we were very much attuned to the light of the moon. So that when the moon was in the dark, not much would happen. It'd be very quiet. And then as you got moonlight in the evening, you'd start to get sounds happening in the lane, and you'd hear maybe somebody walking up the lane playing a flute. And so you'd think, oh, right, there's a jam going on up the hill. So you'd go out and take your bongo drums and go up the hill. And sure enough, you'd eventually find the shed where they were all gathered and playing all sorts of musical instruments. There was always guitars. There was at one time even a sitar. And of course there were moon dances, which were really important. By the time the moon was really full, it was time to go to the dance. And the bands were great.
At the moon dances, I used to be able to put my children asleep under the bench and leave them. Well, you wouldn't do that now, would you?
I used to have these big get-togethers, you know, and taking all, I don't know what they used to do there, but they used to invite us along every night, you know, every month or every couple of weeks.
The full moon mainly.
And no, we said no. We've got to get our sleep. We've got to make a quid. We've got to be up in the morning. That's fine. That's fine. Quite agreeable. Don't want it to go against you what you're doing. You're doing a good job. Oh dear, I can nearly write a book.
We'd read books about what happened in America with, again, this similar movement, and they experienced the same sorts of things with how they ran themselves, you know, the democracies, the feudal lords, the guru types. You know, there was basically somebody had written a book and said, you know, there's 3 or 4 types of communities and that's it. So we started off as with a system where everything was consensus. So for the first 3 years of our community was consensus, and consensus we found was actually very good, except it was very slow. After that, with some big issues that developed, we changed to a democracy system, which was quicker to make decisions, but it was very problematic, democracy, because as soon as you have democracy, you have factions. Democracy gives birth to factions, and so we all learned a lot of basic politics from doing that. And you know, that was the whole thing about what we were doing that I look back on, was that we were learning about life in an unstructured environment, and it was fantastic.
When I was invited to a barbecue in Maynarm in the early days, I went to the butcher and bought a few chops and sausages and took them along with me, and went to this barbecue at Maynarm and took them out, and had a look of horror on the people around the fire when I went to put them on. Said, "You can't put that dead animal on our fire. Go over there and make your own fire." And they looked at my white bread and they said, "Look, he's got White Death as well."
The people over the way, they had children the same age as ours too. So that's the reason we were involved a bit with them, because Ian was the same age as their children. Anyway, they stayed, and Trish said, "Do you mind the boys staying with you?" Well, it was 2 or 3 days before they came back with the boys. That happened frequently.
Good little kids.
Oh, they were lovely children. And that was okay, and I thought bath time, they better get in the bath. And when they come out of the bath, they had white hair, real blonde hair. They were brown before. We'd seen them with gingery brown hair, but it was the soil they were getting, colouring the hair. Oh, I said, "Oh, 2 little blonde boys."
I remember when, at one stage, when we had no money, we went to the police station to ask for money or for coupons or something, because they were available at that time. And the police station was closed, so we went and knocked on the door of the constable's dwelling. And during our conversation, our kids were playing with his kids on the lawn, and he said, "You know, get your kids away from my kids." They thought that we were strange, undesirable, dirty, which, you know, looking back, I can agree with. We were quite dirty.
In Finn Village, there were people were really like a family, so they'd all get together, and people from other communes would come and talk about it. What was this? Oh yeah, this commune Findhorn in England. Those people came over, and of course there was a whole assortment of fruitcakes who came over, like Spaceman Bob, and who wanted us all to go to Alpha Centauri, but we had to turn vegetarian first.
Want the house cow?
Oh yes, they bought a...
Want the house cow. Get their own milk.
Yes. And there's a fair few people lived opposite, and they had all there, and they were going to milk a house cow between them. So that's fine, and we on the other hill watching on, Cole saw them. One fella got up about 6 in the morning and milked the cow. Another fella wakes up about 8 and he goes to milk the cow. Okay, another fella about 11 o'clock thought he would milk the cow.
His was a layback, he'd go about 11 o'clock.
They came over to Cole and he said, I can't understand that cow you sold me, there's no milk in it. Well, he said he had to explain why there was no milk.
I told him what to do when she had the calf.
And the cow went dry, and then they came back and said to Cole, that cow has brown milk. What's the problem?
You didn't tell me right.
He said...
It was also very fashionable to just wear a lap, which was, we all made out of calico, pocket at the front to put all your precious, whatever you needed to carry for the day, and that was all you wore, a pair of work boots or a pair of runners, and you'd charge around all day. You know, you'd have a hammer or you'd have your garden tools, whatever you were doing. Len used to come up with his little pamphlets to, you know, give us the SDA rave, and he would always find us in some state of undress. And he'd try to sort of, you know, carry on the conversation like he wasn't completely horrified. He was very brave, Len, in that way, like quite open-minded, but clearly like, where do I look?
A whole lot of us going down to New Brighton Beach on very strong acid, and we'd go down there for the dawn mostly, and I do remember stripping off and wandering down New Brighton Beach naked, but with a little Afghani hat on. And the rangers drove up to me and told me that I should put clothes on. And I was sort of had this hat and I was trying to hold it, you know, all over the place. But the main problem was that I was just listening to them and I was thinking, what are clothes? Grains of sand don't wear clothes. So that's the only thing I can remember thinking back, oh my God.
But we were the only ones that had a phone on at that time. There was no phones either, so I used to get a lot of calls from their parents, wondering where they were and if they were all right. And but when we get these phone calls, I used to go and it was quite a fair way away, and I went and saw this fellow with a message from his parents somewhere or other. And he said, well, it's a very hot day, I better make you a cup of tea. And I was terrified to have a cup of tea. I didn't know whether I'd even get home again after it. But he said, it's all right, I know how you feel. He said, this is Earl Grey tea. He showed me and I said, oh, I will have that.
I'd been brought up as a, you know, a normal, straight doctor, and when people started coming to see me, they'd make a lot of outrageous demands and requests. And so the biggest problem for me in practice was the clash between science and magic. And I had to try my best to blend these things and be non-judgmental. The use of herbal remedies, homeopathics, radionics, there were lots and lots, and of course there was massage and bodywork, acupuncture, lots of things that I'd sort of heard of but had always been sidelined by the mainstream. But it was impossible not to learn some of this just by osmosis. And particularly useful things became apparently useful, like the use of aloe vera for burns. Graham Staff, who did the carpentry, was also, he grew a lot of medicinal herbs and things on his place in Maynarm, and he taught me a lot about the use of herbs for illnesses, such as if somebody came in with the flu, well, what did you give them? Yeah, all right. So I gave them yarrow. He said, oh, you give them yarrow. All right, I'll give them yarrow, why not? And of course, everybody wanted to use, what's the name of that banned herb? Comfrey, that's the one, yes. That was very popular, and everybody had comfrey tea and put comfrey on their ulcers. There were lots of tropical ulcers. And people loved garlic, and there were a few problems that used it, because it was very creative the way people did self-medicine. And one day I had to pull a garlic clove out of someone's ear. But I learnt so much from the people that I was treating that it just changed my whole paradigm of practicing medicine.
There's the preschool. There's some of the kids for the preschool. We had our own community preschool. I ran the preschool in my shed, with all the valley children used to come to the community. I delivered as a midwife a lot of the children in the valley. Then we had certain protest, the black butt protest, never say road, which we all called because we refused to have road go up into the black butt. Yes, we were very much community minded. And Protester Falls, we all marched over there for Protester Falls. So we were a self-sufficient little valley. Maynarm was another world away almost. So yes, each little valley had its own community that was very, very strong.
It was probably very important pioneering work in the modern diet, that the hippies actually pioneered whole foods and raised consciousness in a way that is just mainstream today. Mind you, when I did cook my meat, all their children came charging over and they all wanted a sausage and white bread.
Being the early 70s or the late 70s, a lot of people did believe in free love. It sort of snuck in the back door sometimes. You could have your partner and you had a lover.
I fell in love with just about every woman that I met in those days, and constantly felt like, she's the one. Yeah, for maybe 2 or 3 days or a week. That's how I was.
When I first got to Finn Village, and it was mainly the Kohinoor crew, there was a big emphasis in love being free and everybody being sleeping with everybody that was all right. It didn't take me long to figure out that it was a real boy thing, because if you're all free now, you've got contraception, now you can sleep with everybody. And I kind of thought, yeah, fair enough, we're free, we can do what we want. But do I really want to sleep with half of you? I don't think so.
A lot of people came here as couples, whether they were married or not, but they came here as established couples or families, nuclear families. A lot of those relationships busted within 3 years, but they didn't flee back to the cities. They formed new relationships with. In fact, there were situations where a kind of semi-permanent husband-wife swap. There were a few of them.
things started evolving pretty early in the piece, which I used to call the spring swap-arounds. Every spring, a whole lot of relationships would fall apart and reformulate with a whole lot of new partners. And I don't know whether it was anything to do with the fact, you know, spring was in the air. It just seemed to start evolving at the same time every year. And you'd sort of go, well, who's it going to be this year?
You know, partner swapping was fairly common because it was an age of experimentation and freedom and finding out. There was even a local saying, which I'm sure you've heard, the definition of confusion is Father's Day in Maynarm.
I personally had problems with this because I'm more monogamous, and I didn't find sex without a long relationship and love easy at all. I attempted it at times. My husband, Michael, was very much a ladies' man and very much into having a whole lot of different women. I don't know whether it was a good thing that he was really honest about it, because he brought them all home, and so you were constantly confronted with this trail of women coming up and down.
Well, we had an open relationship, and that meant that we both had lovers, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. Sometimes there was jealousy, and often it worked really well. My partner, we had people living with us sometimes for a year, sometimes for 2 or 3 years. And it was great. It was like an extended family.
And I think they had a fair bit of free love going up there, so I mean, you might have envied that a bit, but anyway, it was just in passing, because they thought, geez, what sort of a life's this? And not that they ever struck any some deliveries there. They say, oh, Christ, I could go and deliver there, and there's this Sheila and Blake in the Buddy Creek there with nothing on and all that sort of business, and you think, oh, yeah, well, okay, that's the way they live.
You go to some, and it didn't happen very often because I had a young child, but you know, you'd go to parties or something and it'd end up being a bit of an orgy. And it'd be like, oh no, I can't deal with this, so I'd just go home.
And because of our spiritual path, we never got into any of that sort of sexual freedom, because we were kind of couples, and we just stayed as couples. We had small children.
We walked around with no clothes.
Yeah, we never had any clothes on. But there was... no, there wasn't any raging sex going on.
But yes, we were mostly naked. I mean, clothing was just another prop. And I think the guys were mostly more turned on by a woman in a bikini than by naked people at the waterhole, actually.
We found out later that a lot of these old farmers like perving on the girls with nearly no clothes on, but it didn't occur to us at the time.
Witnessed a lot of fights between this lover and that lover.
And thinking about, I've never thought about it before, but I think it was because of our moral code, you know, that you wouldn't do anything to hurt someone else. And obviously there was a lot of hurt that came out of that freedom in the 70s.
At the time, it was really uncool to be jealous or angry or anything like that. And so I took to dulling out the pain or the anger and jealousy with drugs.
We weren't married. No, she was the mother of my children. I think she handled it really well, actually. Towards the end there was more jealousy and eventually we split up.
But then there was also, some people was able to do it well. Some people could have more than one lover. Some couples I know had, two people, one man, two women living in the same house with children to the same man. And they all got on really well.
The strangest thing in hindsight is watching myself interviewing a bare-breasted woman for national television and remembering to keep my eyes on her face. Apparently Barry Humphries got hold of it for something he did. And people started talking, suddenly saying to me, when did you do that interview with that bare-breasted woman? I'm saying, what interview? I'd completely forgotten I'd done it. I can't remember what impact it had in 1976. You'll notice my eyes don't leave her face. I wonder what a parents thought if they saw it.
You have to be a certain person, I think, to be able to enjoy that. A lot of people can't imagine. Like, oh, that's not enough for me, living. Even when we were just traveling up, when we went up north, we see in the camping grounds Germans, and they can't even imagine Australia wouldn't be enough for me, So for a lot of people, and so wouldn't be enough, being here,
And we have friends in the city who find it too far away from everything here. It's too dark at night.
My strongest memory of the whole thing, of course, is that the cameraman Paul Tate came back to Sydney when the shoot was over, announced about a month later that he was leaving the ABC and coming up here to live, and he's lived here ever since. I can remember somebody saying along the way that what would inevitably happen was that these people would, as they put down the roots and their children started to grow and they'd become adults, that they would end up all as part of the mainstream, that they'd eventually develop their own sort of conservatism. And maybe there's some truth in that, but you come back here today, and there is still a difference about this place that I think partly reflects the sort of spirit that brought a lot of those people here at the time.
Well, we quite accepted them. I thought they were quite nice young people, but I never thought they'd live the life they thought they were going to live, where they could be self-sufficient and not be worrying about the rest of the world. But I think they're all living much differently today too. Even one of them said to me in Mullumbimby not long ago, "What did you think of us when we came to Euronbrook to live?" And I said, "Why are you asking me, Trish?" She said, "Because," she said, "these new ones coming in," she said, "we don't like them either."
Upper Main Arm community hasn't changed that much. We're all just getting older and doddery, and I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, we talk about it every now and then about having the sort of hippie alternative to a retirement home because nobody really would fit into Coolamon Villa. I mean, imagine us in Coolamon Villa.
I was telling my sister what I was doing, and she said, yeah, we all become part of history in the end, eventually, don't we?